a doctor is not an easy task, but they are still normal human beings. They eat, sleep, being in a relationship, and also having a bad day as others would do. Being a clinical psychologist is also no exception. A clinical psychologist deals with emotions every time they need to meet with clients. It is such a tough task, but they are taught to be professional at all times.
Hi there, my name is MASTURA and I'm a clinical psychologist here at BINTI Adventist Hospital. I've been in this industry for nearly 5 years now. I would say to myself that this is such an interesting career. Why did I say so? Just because I get to meet many people with different stories, different lifestyle, and somehow it levels me to be stronger each day by hearing their problems and take actions with it every single time. This career is not very popular in Malaysia as people are more well known with psychologists and also psychiatrists. As a clinical psychologist myself, we are specialists in mental health. We have undertaken specialized training in the assessment, diagnosis, formulation and psychological treatment of mental health, behavioral and emotional disorders across the lifespan. The difference between a general psychologist and a clinical psychologist is that general psychologists focus on healthier people, while us, the clinical psychologists, focus on people with more serious mental health issues.
Alright, to answering that question, we're talking now about a clinical psychologist. There is now a scarcity of a clinical psychologist whereby with a clinical psychologist and a patient ratio is only for 1 to 980,000. With this small number, this will make a patient or the people who actually needs help for their mental health have to endure or to bear with the significant weight due to small number of the clinical psychologists. In the perfect circumstances, we can say that Malaysia should have 3,000 psychiatrists equally spread throughout the country. This has shown that Malaysia is in an undersupplied state for the needs of this profession, which is clinical psychologists. The Ministry of Health MOH is looking to hire more contract psychologists to help with the mental illnesses, especially coronavirus related, since global now facing the pandemic issue where the people really need help in terms of their mental health issue. Clinical psychologist is among the most widely practiced subfield in psychology. It entails using psychologist theories, principles and methods to analyze, diagnose and treat mental illness as well as other forms of unusual behavior. Stating that there were only 410 certified psychiatrists in the country as of July 2018, half of them work for the Ministry of Health and the other work for the Ministry of Education and Defence, as well as private institutions and clinical practice.
Selangor has the highest number of clinical psychologists, which is 101 in total. The second highest state is Pulau Pinang, which is 8 number of clinical psychologists in that state. The state of Sabah and Sarawak both have 5 number of clinical psychologists. Johor Bahru has 3 clinical psychologists available in that state. Perak, Negeri Sembilan, Melaka and Kelantan have 2 clinical psychologists in each state. Kedah has one and only clinical psychologist available in that state. The total number of clinical psychologists is 131 in total. 86 of the total number of clinical psychologists is females, while 45 in balance is males clinical psychologists. Next is, where are they all from? In the other word, we call as sector of clinical psychologists. Most of the clinical psychologists in Malaysia is come from private sector. In this private sector, we have 96 of clinical psychologists. Next is clinical psychologists from government sector, which is 25 in total. The third one is semi-government clinical psychologists, which is 4 in total. Next is clinical psychologists from NGO, which is 14 in total. The last one is clinical psychologist from public university, which is 2 in total. Next is the data of international membership. Selangor have 4 clinical psychologists from international level. 2 of them is available in Kuala Lumpur. Then another 2 of clinical psychologists is available in Selangor. In this international membership, 2 of the clinical psychologists is males and another 2 of clinical psychologists is females. Last but not least is the data of international affiliates. Selangor have 4 clinical psychologists from international affiliates. 3 of them is located in Kuala Lumpur, while another 1 clinical psychologist is available in Selangor. For the gender, 3 of the clinical psychologists is females and the other left is male. All of them is come from the private sector. As a conclusion, we can conclude that Perlis, Pahang and Terengganu has 0 number of clinical psychologists. In the other word, these 3 states did not have any clinical psychologists at all.
Sure, there are 2 recommendations. First is, the Ministry of Education should improve the educational system of clinical psychologists in Malaysia to be wider in the terms of job option by providing 2 majors in psychologists, which are Bachelors of Arts and Bachelors of Science, like in the Western countries. By improving this system, it will give a better opportunity for graduate students in clinical psychologists to be placed in public or private services in Malaysia. Also, by increasing the quota for clinical psychologist intake in local university like the National University of Malaysia UKM and the International Islamic University Malaysia IIUM, it can give more opportunities for people to be clinical psychologists in Malaysia.
Besides, Ministry of Health also should increase the number of full-time clinical psychologists on board, especially in public hospital. As I'm doing a research, I found in the Malaysian Society of Clinical Psychology website, only 25 clinical psychologists that work at public hospital, and in every public hospital only provide 1 full-time clinical psychologist on board due to the shortage in this profession that we face nowadays. This makes the patients need to wait about a few months and sometimes a few years to get the treatment at the public hospitals. To solve this issue, the Ministry of Health can put about 3 full-time clinical psychologists in each public hospital by hiring around 450 qualified graduates from this profession that have completed the training to become a full-time clinical psychologist, as we have around 156 public hospitals in Malaysia. So now we can see how clinical psychologist professions are in great demand since mental health issue is quite higher in Malaysia, especially during the COVID-19 epidemic. The distribution for these professions has revealed a scarcity in some states in Malaysia, so the Ministry of Education should play a role in strengthening the clinical psychologist course recruiting mechanism in Malaysia, and the Ministry of Health also need to expand the number of full-time clinical psychologists in Malaysia at the public hospital in order to fulfill the demand for this profession.